Alright, so I'm getting ready to make a heatsink for this frame for my e-bike controller. The controller seen right there. The black aluminum plate is a heatsink that's already made. That white rectangle is thermal padding. And that right there is a bare sheet of 1/8 inch 50/50 aluminum, which I got from the hardware store. Cut to size 6.5 inches by 18 inches. After I make the heatsink, I'll cut it down. This bike has a heatsink that's already on it. You'll notice that's I used 1/4 inch on that one, which is thicker than it needs to be. So I went with 1/8 inch this time. And this is a bike that has the heatsink taken off because I blew up my controller. One very rainy day, was riding in very wet conditions, my fault. I had the controller taken off. This is the heatsink setting on the bike. That's the bottom of the heatsink. The heatsink goes like this on there, and it goes out like that, and it mounts on the frame with 4 bolts, and you mount the controller on there like that. It's mounted on there, and you put some thermal pads between the controller and the heatsink, and also put some thermal pads. There on those vertical cross members there. That transfers the heat to the frame. Here's the thermal pad. It's a strange material, kind of feels almost like silly putty or Play-Doh. Transfers heat. Here's the thermal pad as it sits on the heatsink. You can buy these that have adhesive backing. You can buy them in 1mm, 1.5mm, 5mm or more. This particular thermal pad does not have adhesive backing. This thermal pad will be attached with clamping pressure with a controller mounting bolts. So the heatsink gets attached to these cross members. So each of these cross members is going to need a piece of thermal pad to transfer the heat from the heatsink to the frame. So I'll measure that. Turns out to be 1¼ by 6.5. So I'll cut 3 rectangles to lay on there to mount under the heatsink. So there it is there. We can pretend that the thermal padding is under there on those 3 cross members. And then we'll put the thermal padding cut to size under the Mark II controller. And there it is, it's under there. Note that I use a 24 FET controller where I only needed an 18 FET to save on heat, to reduce the heat that the FETs had to deal with. Instead of 18, an extra 6 to absorb the current. Then make sure after you have it all installed, those wires get lots of duct tape on there to keep the water out. You can put duct tape on the top and the bottom, as much duct tape as you want. And then cover the whole thing with the trunk bag, so that will conduct the heat away from the controller to the heatsink to the frame. So as far as my new heatsinks for my new frame, I use the proper size material, 1/8 inch thick. Gonna put that piece of metal right there. So I need to mount it, drill the holes, and then put on the thermal padding and mount it all up. And then I'm going to trim it to save weight. You will notice that this frame doesn't have any holes drilled on those cross members because I'm going to drill more I want. So what I've done in the past, and it worked out pretty well, is put that heatsink flush with the cross member. Here's a completed view of that. Heatsink more or less flush with the cross member. And it does hang off the rear a bit for mounting my flashing rear tail light. And then after I make sure that that mounts up properly with my 1/4 inch grade 8 hardware, I'll mark the holes where the holes need to be for this Lean Mark II controller. Right there. Drill the holes. So I just had to cut the mounting bracket for the controller because it was interfering with the washers for the 1/4 inch grade 8 bolts that mount the heatsink to the frame. So I cut that with some tin snips, and I'll file it down, make it flat with some pliers, I also had to chamfer those holes because where the holes attach, it was getting in the way of the cross member. So I chamfered those holes and have a certain type of screw. A screw like this that's conical. It'll drop right into that chamfered hole. This is the type of bit you use for chamfering. I also need a hole for that flashing rear tail light. There'll be a hole in the rear there, centered. Get that mounted up. And I also need holes to attach my trunk bag, which has an ABS frame in the bottom. This is the ABS frame at the bottom of the trunk bag. The trunk bag has the big hole cut in the bottom of it to cover, house, and hide the controller, and those 4 holes on the outside of the ABS rectangle are what I use to mount the trunk bag / controller housing to the heatsink. So I need to drill holes in the heatsink. And I use zip ties or cable ties to attach the ABS frame to the heatsink. I like cable ties because they're lightweight, they're very economical, and they don't corrode. This is the inside of my trunk bag. That's a very thin ABS frame that I hogged out a lot to make as much room as possible for the controller, make sure it would fit over there. And I used aluminum rivets, which I like because, like cable ties, they're economical, lightweight, and they don't corrode. And then once it's on there, it just looks like a trunk bag. You can use a neoprene gasket for additional waterproofing, which I recommend. Neoprene, the material they use to make wetsuits, easily available on the internet. You can use strips, or better yet, buy rectangle neoprene and cut out a rectangular gasket. And if you plan ahead, you can attach the trunk bag with 6 holes instead of 4. Get another additional hole in that long side there for additional waterproofing. And as far as finishing the heatsink, the best thing to do is use jet hot coating, the material they use to coat mufflers, which is designed to transfer heat away. I powder coated this one matte black to match my bike.